Ambassador Gorthak of the Zezra Dominion, a towering reptilian with obsidian-black scales and golden ceremonial armor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His clawed fingers tapped rhythmically against the metal podium before him, a nervous tick unbefitting of a species known for its unwavering dominance in war and conquest. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel scraping against steel, before he finally spoke. They're not what we thought," he said, voice rasping with barely contained dread. The assembled diplomats and warlords leaned in. Zezrans did not scare easily. Theirs was a species bred for conflict, their ancestors having dominated their homeworld through calculated bloodshed long before they reached the stars. If Gorthak was shaken, it meant something had gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. Counselor Vreel of the Orlithian Syndicate, a translucent-skinned being with shifting hues of deep blues and soft purples, waved a tendril dismissively. "You speak of the humans?" she asked, her voice carrying the distinct lilt of skepticism. What could they have possibly done to reduce a Zezran to a state of fear? Gorthak's golden eyes darted toward the counselor. "It was not their warriors nor their weapons," he growled. "It was their women." A collective murmur rippled through the chamber. A few representatives turned to their aides, whispering hurriedly in their own languages. The Galactic Council had long been aware of humanity's growing influence. These upstart primates had proven themselves surprisingly resilient, their ships not the most advanced, their fleets not the largest, but their sheer unpredictability and tenacity had won them allies and victories alike. But to claim that their females, their diplomats, posed a greater danger than their soldiers? This was an absurdity. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Gorthak exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. "Let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you why we, the Zezra Dominion, will never, ever send another delegation to Earth." Every being in the chamber listened. The negotiation chamber on Earth had been unremarkable in design, crafted in the sterile, minimalist aesthetic humans seemed to favor, with smooth walls, soft lighting, and an oversized table of dark wood. A long window overlooked a green landscape filled with swaying trees, an unusual sight for most galactic dignitaries, who rarely encountered non-synthetic environments in their own meetings. The atmosphere had been deceptively peaceful. Gorthak had arrived with a full retinue of Zezran envoys, all bred for diplomatic precision. Opposing them was a single human, Ambassador Abigail Carter. She was unimposing by Zezran standards, barely above 6 feet, clad in a dark blue suit that fit her form with the casual efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, but saw no reason to flaunt it. No armor, no weapons, no display of rank beyond a simple insignia on her lapel. She had greeted them with a practiced smile and an outstretched hand. Gorthak had hesitated. He had read of this handshake before. A sign of goodwill. An archaic form of greeting. He had accepted. The moment her fingers clasped his, a shiver had raced down his spine. Her grip was firm, not crushing, not aggressive, but possessed of an unshakable confidence. It was a predator's grip, yet it lacked hostility. It was the most unsettling thing he had ever experienced. They had taken their seats, and that was when things had gone wrong. Abigail Carter had spoken, her voice smooth, even, devoid of any overt emotion, yet laced with a subtle undercurrent of control. She had made no threats, issued no ultimatums, yet every word felt like an inevitability, a path already chosen. "We are prepared to discuss terms that benefit both parties," she had said, folding her hands neatly on the table. Gorthak had expected bluster. He had expected threats of embargo, of military consequences. Instead, he found himself nodding before he even realized it. She had tilted her head slightly. It was a small thing, a minor movement, yet it sent his mind racing. Was it an evaluation? A test? He suddenly felt exposed in ways he couldn't describe. When she leaned forward ever so slightly, something in his very core urged him to retreat. But the worst part, the truly horrifying part, was when she had simply smiled. Not the baring of teeth in warning, not the show of dominant Zezrans and other warlike species used to establish superiority. No, this was a different kind of smile. It was polite. It was pleasant. It was understanding, and it held the weight of galaxies behind it. He had made mistakes in battle before, had been outmaneuvered by brilliant tacticians, had lost soldiers due to miscalculations. But never, not once, had he felt outmatched in a setting like this. Abigail had continued speaking, weaving her words with an effortless grace, maneuvering the discussion without force or coercion. Yet every sentence led exactly where she wanted it to. She never raised her voice, never needed to. She simply waited, and the Zizrins caved. Before he knew it, concessions had been made. Negotiations that should have taken weeks were settled within an hour. His own advisors, seasoned, ruthless diplomats, had fumbled over their words, unable to find an angle that wasn't immediately, effortlessly countered. Then, the final blow. As they rose from their seats, the meeting concluding far earlier than expected, Abigail Carter had once again extended her hand. "Thank you for your time, Ambassador Gorthak," she had said, her tone one of quiet victory. And he had shaken her hand again. In that moment he knew. He knew that she had won the war without ever declaring it. That was when he had truly felt fear. Gorthak's voice trailed off, his eyes dark with the memory. The chamber was silent, every representative now fully understanding the gravity of his words. One of the council members, a towering creature with four glowing eyes, finally spoke. "You mean to tell us that a single human female forced the Zezra Dominion into submission?" Gorthak's claws clenched. "No, she did not force anything. That is the problem." Another murmur of unease swept through the hall. Counselor Vreel's translucent skin flickered in rapid succession, a sign of deep contemplation. "If what you say is true, then humanity's women are more dangerous than their warriors." A deep voice rumbled from the far end of the chamber, belonging to a hulking, crimson-scaled warlord of the Thragan Empire. "This is unacceptable," he growled. "We must establish protocols to resist their influence." Gorthak exhaled slowly. "You won't be able to." The Thragan warlord narrowed his reptilian eyes. "Why not?" Gorthak shook his head. "Because you won't realize you've lost until it's already over." For the first time in recorded history, the Galactic Council was at a complete loss for words. A distress call interrupted the silence, a frantic transmission from another system. The voice on the other end was desperate. "This is Uvrith, our emperor. He surrendered to a human diplomat." The message cut out. Gorthak closed his eyes. And so it begins. No one moved. No one spoke. Somewhere in the distance, the first whispers of a new cosmic order had begun. The distress signal played on repeat across the Galactic Council's main communication display, the distorted voice of a Uvrathian dignitary echoing through the chamber with unmistakable terror. "This is Uvrith, our emperor. He surrendered to a human diplomat." Static swallowed the rest of the message, but it hardly mattered. The meaning was clear. Panic gripped the assembly. These were not weak-willed bureaucrats. Each representative had the backing of empires, war fleets, and centuries of interstellar conquest behind them. And yet, one by one, the mighty species of the galaxy were beginning to understand a horrifying truth. Humanity did not need weapons to take what they wanted. They only needed a woman in a well-tailored suit and a deceptively warm smile. Counselor Vreel broke the silence first, her bioluminescent skin pulsing in rapid succession, the equivalent of an accelerated heartbeat. "This cannot continue. We must understand how this is happening." Gorthak exhaled slowly, his claws pressing into the polished armrests of his seat. "Then we must examine the Uvrith incident." He gestured toward the display, and with a silent command, the Council's artificial intelligence brought up the footage. The recording began inside the Imperial Hall of the Uvrith Empire. Gold and obsidian walls shimmered under the flickering light of ceremonial braziers, casting jagged shadows across the imposing forms of the Uvrathian elite. Towering insectoid figures with segmented bodies and multi-jointed limbs stood in rigid formation, their gleaming chitin armor reflecting the grandeur of their homeworld's ruler. And seated upon the throne, adorned with flowing crimson silks and intricate golden mandibles, was the Emperor of Uvrith. In stark contrast, standing at the center of the hall, alone and unarmed, was Jessica Monroe. She was the sole human present, clad in a simple yet impeccably fitted gray suit. A small United Nations pin gleamed against the lapel, understated yet definitive. Auburn hair pulled into a precise bun, a soft but knowing expression upon her face. She did not appear the least bit intimidated by the monstrous figures surrounding her. The Emperor's booming voice cut through the air. The Uvrith Empire does not negotiate with weaklings. Jessica Monroe did not flinch. She simply reached into her leather-bound briefcase and, with careful deliberation, placed a folder onto the polished obsidian table before her. Then she folded her hands neatly and offered a practiced, patient smile. "I understand your position," she said smoothly, her voice controlled and even. "But I believe we should discuss this further." The Emperor leaned forward, his massive mandibles clicking in a gesture of restrained irritation. "There is nothing to discuss. The Uvrith do not concede territory, nor do we accept demands from lesser species." Jessica's fingers drummed lightly against the folder, just once. The gesture was subtle, but it commanded attention. "This isn't about demands, Your Majesty. It's about opportunity." The room went still. Even through the holographic recording, the members of a Galactic Council could feel it, the shift in power. It was not loud or dramatic. It was something far worse. It was quiet, controlled, inevitable. The Emperor scoffed, waving a massive claw dismissively. "You have nothing to offer that we cannot take." Jessica Monroe remained seated, unruffled. "I beg to differ." And then she did something unthinkable. She reached forward and gently, ever so gently, placed a hand atop the Emperor's massive forearm. The chamber reacted instantly. Guards tensed, weapons shifting, but no one moved. Not a single soul. Because what they were witnessing defied all logic. The Emperor, this titan of conquest, this ruthless warlord feared across the stars, had gone completely rigid. Jessica's hand did not grip or restrain. It simply rested there, warm and confident. And yet, it might as well have been a planetary-scale superweapon for all the devastation it caused. The Emperor's mandibles parted slightly. His secondary eyes twitched. There was something primal, something deeply ingrained in the collective psyche of his species that recoiled at the gesture. It was not an attack. It was not dominance. It was something infinitely worse. It was understanding. Jessica Monroe was not afraid of him. She did not flinch at his size, his power, his threats. In that moment, he was no longer an untouchable deity of war. He was simply a being who had just realized he was utterly, completely outmatched. "I think," Jessica said softly, with that same practiced, knowing smile, "that we should reconsider." The Emperor swallowed, a barely perceptible movement, but enough for the recording to capture. Silence stretched, long, agonizing. Then, in a voice so much smaller than before, the Emperor of the Uvrith Empire spoke. "Very well." The chamber erupted into a chaotic frenzy as the recording came to an abrupt halt. Counselors and dignitaries shouted over one another, their voices rising in disbelief, in panic, in sheer terror at what they had just witnessed. The footage was undeniable. A human woman had single-handedly unraveled one of the most ruthless warlords in the known universe without a single threat, without an ounce of violence. And he had surrendered willingly. "This is witchcraft," hissed a counselor from the Jorvik coalition, his segmented limbs trembling. "This cannot be natural. It must be some form of latent psychic ability," another suggested desperately. Gorthak remained silent, his golden eyes unreadable. He had already come to a grim conclusion, one he suspected the others were too afraid to acknowledge. Jessica Monroe had no powers, no mind control, no telepathic manipulation. She had only one weapon. She understood people, not just her own kind, but everyone. She read body language, micro-expressions, power dynamics. She had turned the Uvrith Emperor's own bravado against him, reducing his empire's centuries of conquest to nothing more than a few well-placed words and an unshakable presence. This wasn't witchcraft. This was human women. The murmurs of speculation were cut short when an urgent notification flashed across the council's main display. Another transmission, this time from a different system. A trembling voice crackled through the speakers. The Thragan warlord has requested a meeting with Earth's diplomatic corps. A new wave of unrest washed over the chamber. The Thragan warlord, a being of unparalleled brutality. He had never negotiated. He had never even entertained the thought. His empire was built on the bones of the weak. His fleets had razed entire colonies to dust. He did not request meetings. And yet, now he was calling for one. Vriel's translucent skin dimmed with unease. Do we know who they are sending? A pause. Then, a quiet reply from the communications officer. Tina Carter. Gorthak inhaled sharply. The name was familiar. Very familiar. Tina Carter, former middle school teacher turned United Nations negotiator. A woman with decades of experience dealing with unruly, aggressive individuals who believed they were in charge. In other words, the Thragan warlord was about to have the worst day of his life. Gorthak closed his eyes. The war had already been lost. The realization settled over the Galactic Council like a suffocating fog. They had spent centuries honing their war machines, perfecting their battle strategies, reinforcing their borders against threats both known and unknown. And none of it mattered, because humanity had sent their women, and there was no defense against them, no countermeasure, no fleet strong enough, no empire vast enough. There was only one path forward, total and complete surrender. Gorthak opened his eyes, gazing around at the assembled council members, all of whom now bore the same expression, dawning horror. And in the distance, the first whispers of a new galactic order had begun. The war councils of the galaxy's greatest empires had convened in secret, deep within the hollowed-out core of a dying star. This was not a gathering for public scrutiny, nor a diplomatic affair where pleasantries and formalities were exchanged. It was a war room, and its purpose was singular: survival. The room was an immense chamber, its walls composed of obsidian laced with veins of liquid plasma, pulsing in a slow, rhythmic cadence. The flickering glow cast elongated shadows over the monstrous forms of the galaxy's finest tacticians, warlords, and intellectuals. The air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken dread pressing against every being present. Seated at the head of the council was Supreme Warlord Zarthal of the Thragan Empire, a towering reptilian behemoth clad in battle-worn armor. His species had dominated war since before the concept of peace had even been entertained in the stars. He had conquered entire civilizations with brute force alone, raising planets and bending their rulers to his will. And yet, for the first time in his reign, he had encountered an enemy he could not best. His claws tapped against the armrest of his throne-like chair, an unconscious tick of unease. "We face an existential crisis," he growled, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "A threat unlike any before." His words were met with nods from the others gathered. There was no need for grand speeches, no need to sugarcoat what they all knew. The humans had done what no other species had managed. They had dismantled entire power structures without war fleets, without planetary sieges, without so much as raising their voices. The horror had come not from their warriors, but from their diplomats, from their women. Councillor Rex of the Zelvari Consortium, a sentient, amorphous mass of shifting bioelectric tendrils, pulsed with agitation. "It defies logic," Rex hissed, his translucent form flickering erratically. "Our predictive models accounted for human expansion, their technological progression, even their military capabilities. But this is something else entirely." Grand Strategist Calvan of the Mekthar Dominion, a cybernetic hybrid encased in polished steel plating, leaned forward, his mechanical optics adjusting with a faint hum. "We have faced biological warfare, artificial intelligence uprisings, and reality fractures," he stated, voice cold and calculated. "But we have never faced something so insidious." There was silence. The assembled minds were the greatest tacticians, the most brilliant warlords, the most ruthless conquerors the galaxy had ever known. And yet they were helpless. Zarthal clenched his jaw, his elongated fangs grinding against one another. We must devise a counter-strategy. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of desperation. Their strength is psychological, Calvan mused, his processors whirring. They manipulate perception, emotions, and power dynamics, without any overt displays of aggression. They do not dominate with force. They subjugate with patience. Rex's tendrils flickered. Then we must learn to resist their influence. A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Yes, resistance was the key. Their failure had been one of ignorance. They had never conceived of a threat that did not involve fleets, weapons, or tangible destruction. But this was different. This was a war of minds, and minds could be trained. Zarthal slammed his fist against the table, the impact sending a shockwave through the reinforced metal. We will create an initiative, a training program designed to counteract human psychological warfare. Calvan's optics flared with interest. A systematic deconstruction of their tactics. We isolate their behavioral patterns, their conversational strategies, and develop cognitive defenses. Precisely, Zarthal confirmed. We train our officers, our diplomats, our soldiers to withstand their influence. Rex's form undulated thoughtfully. It will require exposure therapy. A new plan was forming. The Council would create simulations, controlled environments where their greatest minds could be exposed to human diplomatic techniques in a controlled setting. They would build resistance, learn to recognize and counteract the subtle psychological pressures humans so effortlessly exerted. A group of elite warriors, handpicked for their mental resilience, was assembled. These were beings who had withstood the horrors of war, had faced death without flinching, had never known fear. They would be the first test subjects. The simulations began. At first, they were simple. A holographic projection of a human diplomat, an AI-generated approximation of Abigail Carter, was introduced into the training chambers. The warriors were instructed to engage in negotiations. The first session lasted 7 minutes. All trainees surrendered. The Council reviewed the footage in silence. It was small things. The way the human diplomat tilted her head just slightly to indicate interest. How she remained perfectly still at crucial moments, subtly forcing her opponents into defensive postures. The way she allowed silences to stretch just long enough to create discomfort, compelling the other party to fill the void, often to their own detriment. They adjusted the program. The next session lasted 10 minutes. Another failure. Zarthal refused to accept this. Increase the intensity, he ordered. We must push them further. The next trial involved harsher conditioning. The warriors were forced to endure prolonged exposure, subjected to endless cycles of negotiations. And yet, the results remained unchanged. They fell. Every time. One trainee, a battle-scarred veteran who had once waged a decade-long war against the KLYXX swarm, collapsed in the debriefing room, his breathing ragged. She asked me about my past, he whispered. And I told her everything. Rex recoiled. That is impossible. We programmed the AI to avoid direct mental intrusion. The veteran's expression was hollow. She didn't need to intrude. She just listened. A new terror settled over the Council. This was not just manipulation. This was something deeper. The humans had mastered an art that no species had considered a weapon. Empathy. Zarthal's claws curled into fists. This was unacceptable. There had to be a way, some form of resistance. And then, an alternative proposal. Calvan, who had remained silent for some time, finally spoke. If we cannot counter them, we must eliminate them. The room froze. Calvan's optics gleamed. A surgical strike. We identify their most effective diplomats and remove them from play. A murmur of cautious agreement rippled through the chamber. Assassination was a crude tactic, but perhaps their only viable option. Zarthal nodded. We begin immediately. The first target was Rachel Vasquez. The assassin chosen for the task was renowned across the galaxy, a shadow that had ended emperors, overthrown dynasties. He was deployed with surgical precision, slipping into the human diplomatic complex undetected. He never made the kill. Instead, the council received an intercepted message 2 days later. It was from the assassin. "I cannot do this." The message was garbled, filled with strange pauses and hesitations. She spoke to me, asked me why I do what I do. And I told her. Another pause. A sharp intake of breath. "I have spent my life in darkness." And yet, in an hour, she made me question everything. The transmission cut out. The council members sat in stunned silence. It was over. There would be no counterstrike, no resistance, no victory. Zarthal exhaled slowly, the weight of inevitability pressing against him. He had fought wars that spanned centuries, had broken civilizations beneath his heel. And yet, now he understood. The humans had not conquered them. They had simply walked into the room. And they had won. A slow, chilling realization settled over the gathered warlords. There was no fighting this, only surrender. And in the distance, the first whispers of a new galactic order had begun. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so quiet. It was a kind of silence that only followed the realization of absolute, undeniable defeat. Not the kind that came with war, where fleets burned and empires crumbled, but the kind that crept in slowly, wrapping itself around the mind until resistance became irrelevant. Zarthal sat motionless, his massive frame unusually still, his reptilian fingers curled tightly against the armrests of his throne. The warlord had fought against the impossible before. He had crushed insurrections, had outmaneuvered enemy strategists who had spent centuries preparing for his arrival. But this was not a war he could fight. This was something deeper, something primal. And it had already been lost before the first battle was even considered. The other council members, warriors, bureaucrats, leaders of civilizations that had stood for thousands of years, sat in stunned, suffocating resignation. They had spent years preparing for human expansion, monitoring their technology, anticipating the need for military escalation. They had never anticipated this. The humans had sent their women. Every attempt to counter them had failed. Every strategy, every safeguard, every logical defense against their quiet, terrifying ability to disarm the most battle-hardened minds had crumbled like brittle stone. The warlords of entire empires had surrendered without a single shot fired, their willpower stripped away not by force, but by a gentle smile, a well-placed silence, an unbearable moment of self-reflection they had never asked for. There were no remaining options, no resistance left to be mustered. And so they had called for the last negotiation. The chamber's great doors opened with a low, deliberate hiss, and the humans entered. There were no guards, no visible weapons. They didn't need them. Tina Carter led the delegation. She was calm, composed, wearing a slate-gray blazer and a simple silver necklace. She had the bearing of someone who knew how this would end before it even began, but was kind enough to let the illusion of choice linger a moment longer. Behind her walked Abigail Carter, Jessica Monroe, Rachel Vasquez. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence alone was enough. Zarthal felt something deep in his bones, something he refused to name. It was not fear. Fear was something he could combat, something that could be challenged. This was worse. This was the feeling of inevitability, the realization that no matter how many wars he had won, no matter how many civilizations had fallen before his will, he had never been prepared for this. Tina Carter approached the great circular table at the center of the chamber. She placed a small folder down upon the polished surface, the gesture as unassuming as it was absolute. The gathered leaders did not even look at its contents. They already knew what it held. Terms of surrender. There was no preamble, no grand declaration of conquest, no humiliating spectacle. That was not the way of these human diplomats. They did not revel in dominance. They simply existed in it, effortlessly. Zarthal exhaled slowly, his massive shoulders rising and falling in measured resignation. "You leave us no choice," he rumbled, voice heavy with something that sounded dangerously close to admiration. Tina tilted her head slightly. "You always had a choice, Supreme Warlord." The words were a mercy, and he knew it. There was no negotiation, not really. There was no argument to be had. The war was over before it had even begun. There was no great compromise, no dramatic final stand. Just the quiet, inescapable reality that the galaxy was no longer what it once was. Zarthul reached for the document. His claws scraped lightly against the smooth paper as he lifted it, as though the weight of it alone was pressing down on him. It was absurd, really. He had signed peace accords before, had conquered planets with a single command, had torn down entire governments in the time it took to crush a lesser species beneath his heel. And yet, this simple piece of parchment, this unassuming collection of words, carried more power than the greatest war fleets in history. His golden eyes lifted, locking onto Tina Carter's unwavering gaze. She smiled. The pen felt heavier than it should have. And then, with a single deliberate motion, he signed. A ripple of finality passed through the chamber, as if the entire galaxy itself had just shifted on its axis. One by one, the other council members followed suit, their resignations written in ink rather than fire and blood. The human delegation remained silent. There was no celebration, no revelry in their victory. They simply accepted it, as though it had never been in question to begin with. As Tina Carter gathered the signed documents, she nodded once, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, of quiet understanding. "Thank you for your time," she said smoothly. And just like that, it was done. The humans turned and walked toward the doors, their steps measured, their posture effortless. There was no need for theatrics. There never had been. Zarthul watched them go, his massive hands flexing once before settling against the armrests of his throne. As the doors sealed shut behind the delegation, he let out a slow, deep breath. A long silence followed, stretching between the warlords and council members who remained seated. Finally, it was Councilor Rex who spoke, his bioelectric form flickering dimly in the low light. "What happens now?" No one answered. Zarthul turned his gaze upward, staring at the grand domed ceiling of the chamber, at the star-filled abyss beyond. Everything had changed, and in the distance, the first whispers of a new galactic order had begun.